The Jacob Show today.
Hey, I get to talk about another tornado in our state's history, looking back at the strongest ones over the past 70 years or so. But we don't have to go back too far. Actually, it's a 15-year anniversary for this tornado that occurred on August 12th, 2010. It was a Thursday evening that an EF-3 tornado occurred in eastern Burke County and the far northern part of Ward County. There's a couple of tornadoes that touched down near Bowbells, but the strongest one formed just to the east of that town and tracked along Highway 52 near that gooseneck of Ward County. And that is where the most damage occurred, to some farmsteads along Highway 52, to many vehicles along the highway, to some farm equipment, and a car that was struck that was carrying two people, one of which died in this tornado. The path length was 5 miles and the width of that EF-3 tornado was 400 yards. Here's a picture of the damage to one of the farmsteads along Highway 52. This tornado was rated at the upper end of that EF-3 range at 165 mile per hour estimated peak winds, and those winds were strong enough to toss some heavy farm equipment like this combine off of Highway 52. Here was the weather setup that led to this strong tornado in northwest North Dakota on August 12, 2010. Temperatures were in the low 80s, so it wasn't overly hot, but we did have a lot of humidity. Dew points were in the upper 60s, and that's really a hallmark of some of these strong tornado events in our state's history. You need enough humidity to form these thunderstorms in the first place. Low-level winds were coming out of the southeast, and upper-level winds were coming out of the northwest. So that was creating enough spin or wind shear in the atmosphere for this storm to form. But this was kind of a unique and nuanced situation for this supercell thunderstorm to form, then produce the tornado, because the upper-level winds were coming out of the southwest, but the tornado tracked from the east and then to the southeast, creating enough spin to produce this strength of a tornado. And Chauncey will describe kind of what led up to the strength of this tornado in this type of environment.
There was just enough what we would call forcing in meteorology to sort of overcome the capping inversion to lead to one isolated supercell thunderstorm in the northern part of the state. It seems like that supercell thunderstorm acquired enough rotation, persisted long enough to actually sort of what we would call deviate from the flow, turning to the right. In this case, it means that supercell thunderstorm was strong enough that it kind of started creating its own wind field. Turned more sharply to the southeast instead of easterly like it maybe perhaps originally was moving. That probably enhanced the low-level turning, the inflow of that supercell on a very localized basis, much more than maybe the holistic environment might have suggested across northern North Dakota that particular evening.
So heading into that day, meteorologists knew that the environment was favorable for supercells, but the low-level wind shear did not stand out in a sense of highlighting the fact that tornadoes would be possible this day. So the situation did not present itself to be a big tornado outbreak. It was just that one isolated supercell that tracked out of Canada. There wasn't really a clear boundary either for these storms to form along, but it was that turning or tracking of the supercell to the east and then southeast, turning to the right, that created enough spin, especially in the low levels of the atmosphere, for this tornado to intensify rather rapidly. So here's the tracks of those first two rope tornadoes that were very weak and brief, but they were produced from that supercell thunderstorm. And then the third and strongest one, the EF-3 tornado, formed just to the east of Bowbells and tracked right along Highway 52 and went over the Des Lacs River, the upper Des Lacs Lake, up there in, again, far northern Ward County. And being along a roadway in a vehicle is one of the most dangerous places to be during a tornado. You want to make sure you have your wireless emergency alerts turned on, and being in this situation when there's a tornado threat is not ideal.
One of the most dangerous places to be during a tornado is in a vehicle. If you think about it, they really are able to be tossed. I've seen it on other tornadoes as well, vehicles that maybe didn't have anybody in them that are tossed and destroyed. And in this particular case, yeah, along the highway, unfortunately, this vehicle that was traveling, I believe, eastward along Highway 52 was picked up, tossed. The driver survived but was injured. The passenger, unfortunately, a 51-year-old male, was killed in the tornado. the deviant motion of this particular supercell. So in other words, it was moving more to the southeast than we might expect just from the ambient atmospheric conditions, the wind flow aloft. Tends to result when a supercell thunderstorm almost makes its own wind field. It's rotating strongly enough that its own wind field is starting to regulate the storm. As meteorologists, when we see that storm kind of deviating from the mean winds more and more, in this case, turning more to the southeast, that does raise alarm bells in our minds that something more dangerous might happen. In this particular case, that sort of preceded the intensification of the low-level rotation, leading to those first two tornadoes, and then the third tornado, which was the strongest of them all, the EF-3 rated tornado that occurred in this case.
The storm reports from that day, August 12th, 2010. You can see the damaging wind reports for the complex of storms that went from the border of North Dakota and South Dakota towards Minnesota, produced some tornadoes there, but this was that very isolated supercell that came out of Canada and tracked into northwest North Dakota. That area was not the region that was highlighted for tornadoes going into the day from a forecasting standpoint. So this is quite a unique meteorological setup, and Chauncey will describe kind of how it evolved through that day.
A lot of the focus on the day of the Bowbells tornado was actually in southern North Dakota and then off into Minnesota. There was actually a Boeing complex that affected parts of southern North Dakota that evening. There were watches that preceded that, but the Bowbells storm was kind of all on its own. It was this one supercell that came out of Canada, dropped southeastward through the northern part of North Dakota, but there were warnings out in advance. There were weather spotters that also were reporting in real time when the tornadoes were occurring that helped the Weather Service meteorologists and the broadcast meteorologists communicate that that tornado was ongoing. So there were tornado warnings out in advance. In fact, the EF-3 tornado was preceded by a tornado warning by about 28 minutes in that particular case.
If we look just at our viewing area, going back to the year 2000, this is the second most recent EF-3 or stronger tornado to occur. The EF-3 tornadoes that occurred on June 20th of this year were east of our viewing area. And I'm going to be wrapping up this tornado series next week, talking about the northward tornado, which is the latest in a year that an EF-4 or stronger tornado has ever occurred in North or South Dakota, all the way in late August. So coming to an end of this tornado series, has been really fascinating researching each of these strong tornadoes in our region's history.
And for us, those of us who have lived here, to remember them.
Yeah.
We forget things after 10, 15 years.
Certainly, yeah.
Thanks, Jacob.
You're welcome.